Okay, so in today's session, we'll be concentrating on the Freedom of Information Act, which allows us to access information from public authorities. But there's also two other pieces of information legislation that we will also look at today. And one is the Environmental Information Regulations, which allows us access to environmental information from public authorities. A lot of journalists seem to not seem to be aware of these environmental regulations, and they're incredibly powerful, especially if you're investigating issues like fracking and pollution. And towards the end of the session, we'll look at accessing how to access your personal information from public authorities and private companies under the Data Protection Act. So we'll do an overview of the FOI Act, how to draft effective requests. I will share with you some tips and tricks, as well as some obstacles that you might face, and that does include the coronavirus too, as well as looking at those other pieces of legislation. But back to basics. So the Freedom of Information Act enshrines our right to access information from public authorities in England, Wales, Northern Ireland and UK departments in Scotland. As for Scottish departments, they're covered by the Freedom of Information Scotland Act, and the Republic of Ireland covered by the Irish Freedom of Information Act. But there's not, the principles work the same. There's not a huge amount of differences between those different legislations. And I say you can access information under the FOI Act. And there's a lot of information you can access. That includes letters, emails, minutes from meetings. I've managed to get statistics and data sets before, even notes taken during telephone conversations. So much. Presentation slides as well, leaflets, brochures. And I say that you can access information from public authorities. Well, there's over 100,000 public authorities in the UK. Public authorities can be big government departments, the Cabinet Office, regulatory bodies like Ofcom. A lot of people seem to forget the Electoral Commission, the Gambling Commission, also covered by the FOI Act. You can send requests to councils, schools, academies, universities, except for private universities, hospitals, CCGs, police forces, and so many more. The Act even covers quirkier institutions that you might not necessarily think are covered by the FOI Act. You can send requests to the Big Lottery Fund, Student Loans Company, and even the Tate. Now, unfortunately, you can't send Freedom of Information requests to all public authorities or bodies. You can't send requests to the Secret Intelligence Service or GCHQ or National Crime Agency, which I think is a bit of a scandal, to be honest, because, well, considering their jurisdiction and what they do, I do think they should be covered by the Act. You cannot send Freedom of Information requests to charities. They're not public authorities. But I would, if you are investigating a charity, I would recommend you going on the Charity Commission's website, and you should be able to access charities' accounts or see who the trustees are behind those charities. And you can send in Freedom of Information requests to the Charity Commission to find out more information about perhaps a particular charity that you're looking into. And let me give you an example. So my boss, Peter Geoghegan, a couple of years ago, we were looking into a think tank called the Legatum Institute that was registered as a charity. And what was kind of special about the Legatum Institute was that we noticed that they had a lot of access to government ministers. I mean a huge amount of access. And Peter had a good idea of sending in a Freedom of Information request to the Charity Commission, because the think tank was actually registered as a charity. He sent a request into the Charity Commission asking everything they had on the Legatum Institute, and he managed to get a disclosure where it indicated that the Charity Commission had some concerns about the think tank registering as a charity in the first place. You cannot send Freedom of Information requests directly to members of Parliament. However, if you are, got nothing to do on a Friday night, like me, I tend to go through the MP's registers of interest. They're meant to declare what kind of hospitality they've been accepting, or what the income that they get from their second, third, or fourth jobs. Really fascinating, and I think there's there are stories within those registers of interest. It's just one big PDF on the parliament.uk website. So you can't send requests for information directly to MPs, but if you suspect an MP has been communicating with a public authority, let's say a government department or a local council, you could try to get hold of those communications. You just have to send your request to that public authority rather than directly to the MP. You cannot send freedom of information requests to private companies. But again, if you suspect a private company has been communicating with a public authority, you can still try to get hold of those communications. You just have to send that request to that public authority. What about those lovely companies like G4S and Serco that provide, I suppose, provide public services? Can you still get hold of information about their performance, I suppose? Well, it has been held that where a public authority subcontracts public services to a private contractor, that contractor may then hold information on the public authority's behalf, and that information should be covered by the Freedom of Information Act. Let me give you an illustration of that, how it works. So many, many years ago, I was interested in the number of hours of education young offenders were receiving in young offender institutions, and at the time they were being managed by G4S and Serco. So I couldn't send a request for information directly to G4S because it's a private company. So I had to find out who the contractor was, which was the Youth Justice Board. So I had to send my request to the Youth Justice Board. The Youth Justice Board probably had to consult with G4S. G4S handed over the data that I was requiring. And then the Youth Justice Board, I suppose, gave me the information that I was after. So there's certainly, so you can't send requests directly to private companies, but try to think outside the box. Think about who perhaps contracted out those services, or what public authorities those private companies have been communicating with. Think about ways in which you can circumvent the not being able to send directly to private companies. Every year this comes up, and I'm not entirely hopeful, but there is always talk about extending the Freedom of Information Act to private companies that perform vital public services. Like I say, it comes up every year, but it's worth seeing how this progresses. I really do hope that this does happen, but we'll see. I don't think transparency is on the government's agenda at the moment. So I'm just going to pause there for any. Was there anything unclear in those previous slides I've just shown you? Ian, I'm not sure whether there's any questions that popped up.
Not at the moment. One attendee has just flagged up theyworkforyou.com, but no questions. Anyone got a question you want? Oh, it's kind of a later question here from Richard. What kind of information, if any, can you get through FOI request to Companies House that would be different to information publicly available through Companies House?
Yeah, so I have in the past sent in Freedom of Information requests to Companies House in order to try to get hold of extra information about particular companies. That has been very difficult. I can't remember off the top of my head what exemptions they were relying upon, but it is possible. I would have to check through my past requests to see whether I have been successful at that. But it is, you can put in an FOI request to Companies House for sure. But I'd have to get back to you on that one.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you, Richard, for your question. Anyone else got a question at this point? I don't think so. Jenna, if you want to just carry on, and we'll ask the questions as they come in.
Brilliant. So I think journalists, campaigners, academics can use the Freedom of Information Act in a whole variety of ways. I do think it can help us with our, developing our preliminary research. Say you've spent a long time Googling and you can't seem to find the information that you're after. Let's say you're looking into a particular police force. You can send an FOI request in, like I want to emphasize, it's free to send in. And I know, if you're working in a newsroom or a media outlet that hasn't got a huge amount of resources, use something that is free to use. It doesn't matter what nationality, what you work as, who you are. Anyone can send a Freedom of Information request in. You can be outside the UK in order and send a request in still, although that is being challenged, I believe, but I don't think it will come to much. Documents released can certainly help you build up a timeline. Perhaps you're looking into something a little bit more historical. I've managed to get some documents from the Foreign and Commonwealth Office before, which was handy for my work. I could sit through and sift through documents that helped me build up a timeline of particular events. You can certainly ask for statistics and data sets, and you can interrogate the data and build some interesting data visualizations. Probably the best example I've ever seen of that was from Private Eye. Now, I love Private Eye. And one time they put in a Freedom of Information request to the Land Registry, and they managed to get hold of a ton of data of leasehold and freehold interests acquired by offshore companies, and they mapped it. And I believe that the data sets that helped them create this is still on their website. And I believe the data set helped them to develop other stories around property and crime. But my favorite use of the Freedom of Information Act is, I think, is a powerful tool to allow you to delve into who's been whining and dining with who's been lobbying who. I think it's a really important tool to find out the inner workings of government, whether that's, how big central government departments work, all the way to local government and to your local council, your parish council. One particular example I was quite proud of is, or how I've used it before was, this was actually my first story for Open Democracy. A couple of years ago, there was a guy called George Papadopoulos who was in the news constantly. He was quite close to Trump, but he got arrested for lying to the FBI. And there'd been a couple of things circulating on the internet saying that Papadopoulos had met UK Foreign Office officials, but there was no further detail on that. No one knew how many times that had occurred. So I just sent in a Freedom of Information request to the Foreign and Commonwealth Office asking for how many meetings have occurred, who between, and it was disclosed to us that Papadopoulos had met UK Foreign Office officials at least 3 times. And in one of the meetings, they talked about Brexit, which was kind of interesting. And so we quickly turned that disclosure into a story. Now, as I'm sure you all know, sometimes your Freedom of Information request can be rejected on one or several grounds. But I think depending on the public interest with that's connected to this, if your request is rejected, I think there's nothing wrong in turning rejections into stories, providing there's a significant amount of public interest at play. So one successful example, actually I saw a very successful example of it today. I believe Press Gazette asked HMRC how many companies have benefited from furlough or something like that. I'll leave it up to you to look into, and they got a rejection, but they turned that into a story. But let me show you the one on screen. So a few years ago, David Cameron, our former Prime Minister, I forget sometimes that he was our former Prime Minister, he authorised a drone strike that killed two UK nationals who had joined up to become fighters for the Islamic State. Now, at the time, that was authorising a strike that was hugely controversial, you know, in legal terms. And a lot of journalists, including myself, wanted to get hold of the legal advice that David Cameron relied upon when he authorised that drone strike. And unsurprisingly, that request was rejected due to, I think, about 5, 6 or 7 exemptions. But that didn't stop James Ball, who worked for BuzzFeed at the time, from turning that rejection into a story, a hard-hitting story. And I was a bit jealous because I thought, oh, damn it, that was a really good idea that I could have done anyway. More recently, I think this is a really good example. Reuters have been doing some, you know, at the beginning of well, when the pandemic hit, they've been doing some really brilliant investigations. And they, sorry, that's my boss calling me. Apologies, I can ignore that. Don't tell him that. They have been looking into, they wanted to try to get hold of data or the breakdown of deaths in care homes, and they sent in requests, but they were refused. But again, they just turned that into a hard-hitting story. So how do you write FOI requests? Well, they can be really straight, you know, they can be as easy as sending an email. You can draft them very, very specific or quite broad, especially if you're going on a bit of a fishing expedition. They can be a few lines long, they can be a couple of paragraphs long, but I think as journalists, campaigners, academics, we want them to be effective. We want to try and get something out of it that's going to help us write our articles or develop our investigations. So I thought it would be quite nice to go through some examples. So example 1. So I am asking for information about meetings between a minister and an organisation in 2019. Now, you'll see in all my requests, I always, in my first line, I say, look, this is a request for information under the Freedom of Information Act. I say this at the beginning for 2 reasons. One, I want to assert my my right to information, but secondly, I don't want this being treated as a press inquiry. I need this to go to the right person that you know deals with information requests, information officers. I don't want to get lost in the system. Now, this is not a very effective request, and I'm wondering if anyone could tell me why. If you want to put in a couple of comments in on the chat.
So you want us just to have a read of this and figure out what's ineffectual about this, what specifically.
Exactly.
So if folks, if you want to just type into the chat any thoughts you have, anything that sticks out. Mary says too wide and not specific enough.
Can you give me it's okay, so yeah, hit the nail on the head, but how could one improve this then? What should we be asking for?
So let me just read through some of this. Russell says, you know, we need to define what information exactly is. Lila says, it doesn't say what information you want, which means they can leave out the juicy stuff. Nixon says maybe too broad. Best to say which dates and what information you would like. Nassar says vague on information about meetings, specific information about the meetings and why.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
I think that's really good. So we picked up the 2 main points. Was 1, it's a year. You're asking for a year's worth here, year's worth of information. 2, it's that, what do I mean by information about meetings? That's really broad. And so if I sent this request into one department, they might interpret information as just meaning emails. Another one might interpret information as, okay, so she maybe wants emails about this meeting. She also might want, I don't know, minutes of the meetings. Information is that term is such a wide term. I would really recommend breaking it down. So because of the nature of my work, I do tend to ask for information about meetings between a minister and an outside organisation, because I'm fascinated with lobbying at the moment. And when I ask for information about meetings, there's a few things that goes through my head. First of all, if I can, I know sometimes it's not possible, perhaps if you're asking for meetings in regards to police forces or local councils. What I do try to do is I try to locate meetings that have occurred, and I try to build my request around that. So let me give you an example. So what I tend to do, because again, I'm quite sad on a Friday evening, I do like going through the transparency data release by the gov.uk, on gov.uk. So government departments have to publish the meetings that their ministers have undertaken. That includes special advisors as well, and senior officials. And I go through this data, and I pick out maybe 1, 2, 3, maximum 5 meetings that have caught my eye that I want to ask for more information about. And I also, if you're ever interested in this, just as a side note, Transparency International has created an amazing publicly available database where they've scraped information about ministerial meetings, and they put it all in one searchable place. It's an amazing resource. But anyway. And then what I tend to do is, once I've located a meeting that I'm interested in, I then ask for the following information. I always ask for a full list of attendees, and I ask for the full names and titles of each attendee and who they represent. Because you might know that Minister Y was there and Organisation Z was there, but there was a John Smith in the room. You have no idea who John Smith represents. I asked for the time and duration of when the meeting takes place. Partly because, if it was a 20-minute meeting, I think maybe something like, it might not have been as important as a 3-hour long meeting, who knows. I tend to ask for the location of the meeting. That's me hoping that one day, a meeting was held in some fancy 5-star restaurant. That hasn't happened to me yet, although I did get a disclosure last week where a meeting took place in a fancy, not restaurant, but a nice fancy place instead of a boring old government building. I always ask for the copy of the agenda of the meeting, as well as materials that were handed out and received during the meeting. So that covers things like presentation slides. A lot of people forget that you can get presentation slides under the FOI Act, brochures, reports, leaflets. And when you think about it, when a minister perhaps goes to a meeting, they might have briefing notes and papers that they take with them to the meeting. So this is all I think when I put these requests in, I tend to be quite successful. I tend to get a good, disclosure hit. Whereas if I put in the other one, I tend not to. I tend to round off my Freedom of Information requests like this. I ask for the information in electronic format. However, if you're asking for statistics or data sets, you can specify what format you want it in. But you've got to do it in that request. Okay, you can specify whether you want it in a CSV format, an Excel format, and I also say, look, if you think that the request is too broad, please contact me and provide assistance as to how I can refine it. What I'm trying to do is encourage a conversation with someone who is dealing with my Freedom of Information request. Now, as we'll later, soon see, that it takes at least 20 working days to get a response from a public authority. I would rather them contact me now to say that my request is too broad than wait 20 working days and then them turning around saying that the request is way too broad. This, I can tell you, this tactic varies from public authority to public authority. With the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, they're great. They get back to me ASAP. They tell me how I should refine it. Same with the Electoral Commission. Others, less so. I, like I say, put these type of requests in all the time. There was, I read an interesting Times article where there was a mention of a meeting that took place between Cressida Dick, the head of Metropolitan Police, and Priti Patel, the Home Secretary, where Extinction Rebellion was discussed, and I wanted to find out a bit more about that particular meeting, so I sent that in. I managed to get hold of some information, and we got some information about this meeting, which we then turned into a story. There was a disclosure that indicated that Cressida Dick wanted to work, alongside Priti Patel's people to perhaps look at how the law surrounding policing can be developed, and we know what that means around protesting. Anyway, that made a good story. So let's go for another one. So I might ask for communications between a minister and an outside organisation, a person, from 2017 to the present day. Now, it's a valid request, but it is not effective. Can anyone tell me why? If you just want to put a couple of comments in the chat.
Well, Mavonwe says they'll say it costs too much to comply. Elizabeth suggests communications is a bit too vague. Joanne says, is there an issue of privacy rights if this is a private person that we're talking about here? Mary says the dates are too wide, too vague. Likewise, Phoebe. Yeah.
Excellent. Hit the nail on the head. I know sometimes as journalists we can be a little bit greedy and ask for everything, but unfortunately we have to be careful. But exactly, I'm asking for 3 years worth of communications. It's way too much, way too much. And like you pointed out, communications, that's a vague term. Like I said, communications might be interpreted as just emails, or someone might interpret communications as emails and letters, and others might interpret it differently. So it's much better to just break down what you mean by certain phrases that you use in your requests. A few things to consider. A big government department, if it costs them over £600 to comply with your request, it's going to get rejected. That equates to 24 man hours. I'll talk about man hours in a minute. For smaller authorities, if it costs over 450, they will reject it. And so, especially if you're new to freedom of information requests, you will hit this quite a bit, this cost thing. Now, when I talk about man hours, I talk about, someone receives your FOI request, they get out from their desk, they go to the filing cabinet, they sift through the documents, they extract the information that you want and send it over. That's all included in the man hours, okay? But if you do think your request is in danger of that, happening, it's going to get rejected on costs, well, just try to narrow it down, try to include a narrower time frame. Or instead of putting forward 10 questions, maybe select 5 maximum, okay? So just always have that cost thing in the back of your head. So this is how I typically draft a request where I'm asking for communications between a minister and an outside organisation. This can apply to a councillor and an outside organisation, or a member of the police force and an outside organisation too. But yeah, I do tend to, so I've asked for 6 months of communications. That is slightly pushing it. I think 3 months is good. Yeah, 6 months is pushing it. Anything beyond 6 months, again, you're slightly pushing it. If you're asking for a year's worth of communications and more, manage your expectations, and that it could be rejected due to costs. I also define what I mean by communications, emails and their attachments. I always get that in because sometimes I tend to get emails and there's missing attachments, and it's annoying. I always ask for letters, memos, briefings, etc. What I've started to do now is I have also, because I'm always fearing that cost exemption, I sometimes put in my freedom of information requests to say that I'm just happy if you want to conduct an electronic search only. I don't want someone spending a long time going through trying to find something that is on paper, because it, you know, pushes up the old man hours. And I have sometimes indicated what I want the communications to refer or relate to. And I have been getting some success with that, actually. So when I was asking for information, I asked for communications between the Metropolitan Police and Priti Patel that mention or refer to the Extinction Rebellion. So you can do that. And I think that makes your request a little bit more narrow if you specify what you want the comms to refer to or relate to. And I have been finding that quite helpful at this point in time. Another thing to watch out for is aggregation. I mean, so if you submit a Freedom of Information request one week to, let's say, the Ministry of Justice, and then submit a request on the same subject or a very similar subject the following week, let's say to the same authority, to the Ministry of Justice, you are at risk of having those two requests being aggregated. And if you have them aggregated, being dealt with together, you're at risk of them having been refused on cost grounds. That can be, I don't encounter this at all now, but when I first discovered Freedom of Information, and I was slightly trigger happy with sending out loads and loads of requests, sometimes my requests would be aggregated because they were on the same or similar subject. What I should have done, if I feared aggregation, I just sort of, you know, send in one request and receive a response, and then send in the second request and then receive a response. But do look into aggregation as well. Let's do another one. Okay, so this time I'm sending a request to a council. I'm asking for 2019, please provide details of overseas trips undertaken by council officials. It's a valid request, but why isn't it effective as we'd like it to be? Just type in the chat. Or if I rephrase that question, if you were thinking of doing an article about overseas trips undertaken by council officials, what kind of juicy details do you want to get out of this?
Well, Mavanwi says this information might already be on the council website. Archie's saying you're not being specific about what details. Jude is saying it's not in the government's jurisdiction. Elizabeth says not specific about details. Are these details of travel or meetings or things done while overseas? Chris points out that councils use financial years rather than full year. That means you could miss something. Mary points out no detail of the official to whom it relates. Deirdre saying, talking about, well, you know, who actually funded the trips, that could be relevant. Yes,
these are all very good suggestions. But I think the main thing for us is that the details. Someone brought up the years. You're absolutely correct. It is always worth specifying what kind of year you want your data for. You know, financial years are very different to calendar years. Calendar years are very different to academic years. That's an excellent point to bring up. But I'm not particularly concerned about I mean, I could be more specific and say calendar year 2019. I should have probably done that. But I'm more, I suppose, it's the details I want, the details of the overseas trips. I want to know, first of all, I want to know the name of the council official and their position. I want to know, you know, where did they go abroad? I mean, what was the purpose of that trip? I mean, we all know by now that we can communicate with people across the Atlantic using Zoom. Why would it be necessary for someone to go and visit there? But the funding is also important. Ideally, you want to get a top line of X amount of trips worth X amount of money met by the taxpayer, you know? This is how I this is how I would phrase such a request. So I would especially like to know the date and duration of the overseas trip, where they went, the names of the council official, but the reasons why they went. I'm looking also for the cost of the overseas trip. Like I want, and you know, when you're asking for things about costs of something, you want a breakdown of those costs. So in this instance, I want a breakdown of travel costs, accommodation costs, expenses. I could go a lot more. I could go a lot more. I could develop that even more. I could maybe I would ask them to specify, okay, what kind of accommodation those council officials stayed at. Was it 4-star, 5-star? I could go even further with the travel. I can say, did they fly economy or did they go first class? And I also always ask for who met the cost of those overseas trips. So was it the taxpayer in the end, or was it partially funded by an outside organisation? If so, who was that organisation? Okay, these are all the kind of details that will make your story more interesting, I believe. So I did this back in 2017. I sent it to all UK councils and got lots of disclosures. I was very happy about that. And I sent a disclosure to Yorkshire Post, and we found out that Sheffield Council had spent £30,000 on trips to China that was connected to a failed luxury hotel plan. So again, it was nice to see those details. I got those details through a disclosure, and that turned into a nice story.
So I guess, Jenna, sorry to butt in here, but I guess it's part of the key to this is visualizing what the story will look like at the very, very end. Just with the detail and all the all the kind of things you'd love to read about, and then work backwards from that. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, that's what I tend to have in my head. It depends on what sometimes with, let's say if I'm doing a fishing expedition, I might not necessarily have an exact story in my head or what it could be, but I certainly, I know what I'm looking for if I get a disclosure and it has the information that I'm praying for. But I think the best requests are when they're very specific and you're breaking down things that you need to create a good story. Yeah, you're right, Ian. That's a good way of phrasing that.
Thank you.
But I do like a fishing expedition now and again, and okay, sometimes it can be a bit lazy on my part, but I do feel that I have managed to get hold of some good documents by this approach. So a couple of years ago, I was interested in a piece of legislation that was going for the Dominican Republic that risked thousands of people becoming stateless. There wasn't a huge amount of that information on the internet. So I wanted to see whether the Foreign and Commonwealth Office had any more further information about this particular piece of legislation. I stuck in a freedom of information request. I'm quite lazy with this. I don't even specify what I mean by correspondence and communications. I don't even give a time frame in this. I felt it was going to be rejected due to costs. I felt I was slightly taking the mick here because I'm asking for a lot of information. But I ended up getting over 50 documents released to me, and I could sit there and sift through what was happening on the ground in the Dominican Republic at the time. So, I don't think there's anything wrong with sending requests in that are quite broad. You might get some interesting information, but in the back of your head, always think that it could be rejected due to costs. So you have drafted your email. Sorry, you drafted your FOI request. You need to find the correct email address to send it to. Those email addresses should be that you should be able to locate them on the public authority's website. You might have to do a bit of digging around, but usually, let's say you take your local council, they tend to have a page that says transparency or democracy, and you should be able to find where to send an FOI request to there. However, if you cannot, for the life of you, find that correct email address, the FOI directory has compiled pretty much all the FOI requests, email addresses that you'd need to send in an FOI request to. So you send a request in, you should get an acknowledgement, and you should receive a form of response in 20 working days, but sometimes it can take longer, which we will definitely talk about a little bit later on. Now, yes, can't ignore this. The coronavirus has had an impact on freedom of information. What was particularly worrying at the beginning of, I think it was in March, that in Scotland they introduced emergency powers that gave public authorities up to 60 working days to process FOI requests. That's rolled back now, but I do think when it's sorry, I'll come back to a thread in my mind in a minute. Now there hasn't been any UK emergency powers that have affected FOI in the UK, but I would manage your expectations again, and you might encounter some delays. There were certainly quite a few delays at the beginning when the pandemic hit, especially with councils and NHS trusts. I think that's absolutely reasonable to brace yourself for delays. But then there were some authorities that were suspending their FOI services, which I do think is unreasonable to do so. I think we live in a time where decisions are made fast and contracts are awarded fast, and we need to have some kind of mechanism to scrutinise those actions. And I do think that's a space for FOI and for us, for FOI to be completely suspended in some circumstances, or I just think is wrong. Totally fine with expecting delays, I understand, but to suspend a right to information is I don't agree with that. I can say at this point in time, perhaps over the past 2-3 months, it's been okay. I haven't really experienced a huge amount of delays, apart from the Cabinet Office that I'm getting a bit frustrated with in regards to their awarding of contracts. Some institutions like universities have been experiencing delays as well, especially around the September time when students were coming back, and then there was big increases in coronavirus cases. I think we've got to probably brace ourselves. I mean, who can predict the future? I can't, and 2020 has certainly taught me that lesson. But with a oncoming second lockdown, I think we could be heading in for some delays with your FOI requests. Maybe some suspensions. I don't know. I don't know how long this oncoming second lockdown is going to last for, but something definitely to think about. So I'm just going to pause there. Is there any questions before we move on to some more tips and tricks when sending requests?
Again, if you just want to put your questions into the chat column at the right-hand side. No, I don't think so, Jenna. If you want to just carry on, and we'll if there are questions, we'll come to them.
So some tips and tricks. I've been doing this for quite a while now and would like to share with you some of my top tips. My biggest one is do check whether the information that you're after is already available. It takes 20 working days, at least 20 working days to get a response to an FOI request. Please do your background, dig on, in the internet to try to get hold of the information, to see whether it's available. Now, public authorities should really be proactively publishing requests that they've previously answered on their disclosure logs. I know some councils are very good at this, others aren't. I know the Metropolitan Police are quite good at publishing their previously answered requests. I know the Ministry of Defence is also very good at this, but other government departments like Department for Education, not so much. So do check disclosure logs first as well. And I would really, really recommend the What Do They Know site for inspiration too. So with this site, you can send in a request. The platform sends it on your behalf, that your request is published for all the world to see, and the response is published for all the world to see. So I could look through What Do They Know to see what kind of information people have been asking for previously, as well as how those public authorities have reacted to those type of requests. And there have been many times where I've looked through What Do They Know and found some really interesting data sets. So I don't have to send in requests for those data sets. They're there for all the world to see. Disclosure, I did used to work for My Society, who run What Do They Know, but massive fan of What Do They Know. Another tip is always chase your requests. If you don't receive an acknowledgement in the first 3 working days, you chase it until you get an acknowledgement. Now, usually you should, get an automated acknowledgement. But there have been times where I put in a request, forgotten about it, then remembered that, on the 20th day, I haven't received my request. I get in touch and saying, hey, can I have a response to my FOI request? And they turn around and say that they didn't receive the request in the first place. That's a tremendous waste of time. So I would really recommend you chasing up acknowledgements. When the 20 working day deadline hits and you have not received a response, you chase it until you get a response. Don't let them, get away with it. But I'll talk about delays to responses a tiny bit later on. You can ask for help as well. Under the Act, Section 16, you can ask for advice and assistance. There have been times where I've got in touch with the information officer at a particular public authority and say, look, I'm thinking of sending this. I'm not entirely sure how to phrase this. Could I possibly ask for some advice and assistance? A couple of weeks ago, I got in touch with the Electoral Commission because I was going to send in an FOI request. Got in touch with the information officers and asked whether the information that I wanted, whether the request is actually going to be feasible and whether I'm likely to get the information. It was a bit of a technical thing that I was asking for, but do ask for help. And I would also plan your requests in advance. If you've got an upcoming investigation or long-term feature and your deadline is in 2 weeks' time, 3 weeks' time, I'm going to say you sending in an FOI request now, you're probably very unlikely to get a response before the deadline. Okay, so do think about that. Now, I showed you that slide where I sent a request into all UK councils asking for information about council official trips, overseas trips. And that's what I call a mass or batch request. Now, those type of requests they are big projects, I'm not going to lie. And they can take up a lot of time and energy. But, the results can be very good. But if you're ever going to embark on such a project, I would recommend a few things. I would actually send off some tester requests to a small selection of your targeted authorities. I have been in that position where I have sent off 300 FOI requests and every single one of them has come back and said, we can't give you this, your request is refused because it costs too much to comply with. That is a tremendous waste of time. So I would really encourage people to send off tester requests, see what kind of information you get back or what kind of response you get back. Read through those responses and see whether the project is viable, or do you need to go back to the drawing board again and redraft your freedom of information request. I would really encourage that. Okay. And if you're happy with the responses that come back, and by all means extend it to the other authorities, but you will have to be organized when you're embarking on such a project. You will definitely need to create some kind of spreadsheet to track your requests. So in a typical spreadsheet, I would have the date I sent the request on, the public authority I sent the request to, when am I likely to get a response, a column where I've got the results of the FOI request, and I really want to keep it tidy. Now, there's a really good toolkit from What Do They Know, where you can send large batch mass requests, and that is through something called What Do They Know Pro. It's a subscription service, and what's nice about this is that it keeps requests and responses private, but it's also very good to manage big mass batch requests. You can send those mass requests at a click of a button. And what is nice about this is that you can download responses in a nice zip file, and you can go through the responses like that, whether as opposed to getting responses to your private email address and it clogging up your inbox. It's just What Do They Know Pro is a really good platform to send a batch requests off. So I use that now. I'm going to pause there. Is there any questions so far before we move on to obstacles, FOI obstacles?
Yeah, well, listen, why don't I put a couple of questions to you that maybe relate. So Archie was asking at the very beginning, can you send the same FOI request to multiple bodies at the same time? And I think that is covered just with what you said about batch requests.
Yeah.
But Archie also asks about, can you also send the same FOI request to EIR? I've heard that sometimes EIR can be more forthcoming.
Oh, under the EIR regulations.
Yeah.
Oh, can we talk about that a little bit later on?
Yeah, sure. Okay.
Yeah.
Amy says, as a student or someone with little experience, are you any less likely to be granted the request of information as opposed to someone with more authority?
Okay, that's a really good question. When an authority gets a freedom of information request, they've got to treat an applicant blind. So your background, student, journalist, campaigner, activist, whatever, that shouldn't come into consideration at all. So your request is treated the same as the average person on the street, theoretically. So I wouldn't have any worries about that, about yours request being treated differently. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Jenna. And kind of related, John asks, what can be done when organizations withhold information which they provide to others and the Information Commissioner's Office are unable to get them to comply with the request? Sounds as if maybe John has personal experience.
That sounds, well, why don't we talk through about exemptions and knockbacks, and then perhaps we can revisit that, and maybe
yes.
That sounds like a very specific case that has happened. Yeah.
So if that's all right, John, we'll come back to that. And then just finally, Chris wants to know, with regards to What Do They Know Pro, does What Do They Know Pro, does it file your requests in real time? Does it send them off in real time?
Yes. Yeah, it's very good. Yeah.
So it's completely automated, essentially.
Yes, it's a really. I believe I've got someone that works for What Do They. I want to say What Do They.
Yeah, no, I think there is. I think I saw a My Society email address there. So
I would, yeah.
So maybe they could. Yes, Mavonwe says yes. So maybe Mavonwe can just answer that for us in the chat. Great. Well, Jenna, do you want to carry on, and then we'll come back to John's and anyone else's questions?
Yeah, I'll be interested in hearing more about that. Yeah. Okay. Or if I'd have to say, if you are uncomfortable with sharing it to everyone, happy to,
Sure.
I've got my Open Democracy email address there.
Yes.
So, yeah.
And sorry, Mavonwe says yes. What Do They Know Pro sends off your requests as soon as you submit them. Thank you very much for that.
Cool. So let's go through the kind of responses that you are likely to get. So you might get a full or partial disclosure, and you might have enough to, help you develop your articles or your investigations. We've talked through cost refusal, if your request is rejected due to costs, you can send it in again, but make sure it's a little bit more narrower this time, and really read through the cost refusal, why they're refusing it on cost grounds, because they might give some hints as to how you can rephrase your request and send it in again. They might say, okay, instead of asking for 8 questions, we will be able to provide a response to 4 of those 8 questions. Reading through those refusals can be really helpful. None of you should really be getting vexatious. So under the Act, there's a specific section which protects authorities from requests that cause undue disruption and that are incredibly burdensome. Like I say, you shouldn't really be getting it. I've only got it like twice or 3 times. One instance was because I asked for 10 years worth of ministerial diaries of a particular former minister. I was definitely taking the mick there. 10 years worth. That's even I believe that I should have been deemed vexatious, because it's just way too much. I'm causing a huge amount of disruption there. Also, requests could be deemed vexatious if you use not very nice language in requests, or if you are you send the same request to the authority every day. So when you're communicating with an information officer, please be polite, which I'm sure you will always do. The authority might turn around and say, and they might say, we don't have the information that you're after, we don't have it. But if you think they do, whether that's through a source or through your own research, I would go back to them and say, thank you for your response. I would like you to conduct another search, and that's through an internal review. We'll talk about internal reviews a little bit later on, but if you're not happy, do get in touch and ask them to conduct another search. So sometimes you will get an email to say that the authority needs another 20 working days to deal with your FOI requests, especially when there's an element of a public interest coming into it. It's incredibly annoying when they extend the deadline by 20 working days, but they can do that. However, if they keep extending that 20 working days deadline by another 20 working days, another 20 working days, another 20 working days, and you're not getting anywhere, you've really got to complain to the Information Commissioner's Office. Okay, those who oversee FOI in the UK, you have to complain to them and they will prompt the authority into action. A public authority shouldn't really be, I always get those idioms mixed up. Is it kicking the can in the long grass or something, or kicking it down? I can't remember. You can't be, it's not good that they keep fobbing you off by asking for more and more time. They're not allowed to do that. You might get a neither confirm nor deny response. If you are looking into security or law enforcement, you might get this. So under the Act, an authority has to either confirm they have the information or say that they don't. But them confirming or denying that information, can theoretically be quite sensitive. Let's say there's a war going on, you put in an FOI request asking for details of a particular battle plan. Them confirming that battle plan exists or them saying that it doesn't exist can theoretically aid the enemy. So that's when they would, have a neither confirm nor deny response. Or, your request could be refused on one or several exemptions, several grounds. There's lots in total. And I tend to categorize them into 2. The first being absolute exemptions. That's when the authority just doesn't have to give you the information that you're after. It doesn't have to communicate it to you. You can't ask for Her Majesty's communications with government departments because there's a specific exemption there which doesn't allow you to do so. Absolute exemptions, they are quite tough, but it's not impossible to argue against them if you're appealing them. But we'll come back to appealing a little bit later on. To me, qualified exemptions are the kinder of the 2. That's when a public authority has to state whether or not it holds the information and if so disclose it, unless the public interest in non-disclosure outweighs the public interest in its disclosure. So what the authority does is it conducts like I suppose a balancing, a scales exercise. Things that tip in favour of disclosure are things like transparency, accountability, throwing light on potential corruption. Things that tip in favour of non-disclosure are things like, okay, government officials need a safe space to work on government policy. I hear the safe space argument all the time. And there's quite a few qualified exemptions as well. I wanted to bring this up because I think Ian, you touched upon this at the start. With big government departments like the Cabinet Office, we are unfortunately seeing more and more requests being refused. I couldn't really tell you why that's so. As you'll see on the screen, that's a dangerous looking sort of dark pink there, indicating less and less requests being refused and being granted in full. For me, that's worrying. The government would probably say that that's because they are publishing more and more publicly available information, more data. I don't really buy that argument because what governments put out in terms of data sets or publish things, that's what they want you to see, or cherry picking things that they want the public to see. I don't take that argument. What I think is happening is that I think big government departments have got into the habit of just refusing things without really taking into account the specifics of each individual case, and that they're not fearing any, appealing. Or they're not expecting the requester to appeal because it takes a long time to get a response anyway in the first place. And so I think that's happening more. I did read a statistic the other day that only a very, very small percentages of FOI requests sent to big government departments are appealed. And what I would like you all to take away from today is that do have a go. We'll talk about how to appeal in a minute, but if you are not happy with how your request has been handled, please, please, please do appeal. You've got to do it at least once in your career. And you never know, you might get a kick out of it. I certainly do. Yes, do appeal. Well, I've got that in my head. So, okay, so how do you appeal against exemptions? How do you appeal against these grounds? So what you do need to is to request an internal review, and you've got 2 months to do that. And there's 3 things that happen in my brain is that I always read on what exemptions the authority is relying upon. Why have they refused my request? I read the response first of all. Then I read up on the law. The Freedom of Information Act, compared to other pieces of legislation, it's quite, I'm going to say, straightforward. And the Information Commissioner's Office have published guidelines for each exemption, and I would really encourage you to read through those guidelines because they indicate when and when not a public authority can rely upon such exemptions. They're really handy, and I refer to them all the time. Once you've read up on that, think to yourself, should the exemption really apply in this context? Do you think they're wrong? Give reasons. And if the exemption is a qualified exemption, think of some really good public interest arguments as to why the information should be released. Okay. My third step is I would then start drafting out my arguments. I would sometimes get a friend of mine to read through them and just to, make sure that I'm making sense. And when I'm happy, I send them to the public authority asking for them to conduct an internal review. There's lots of resources out there to help you. I really would encourage you to do it once. You don't need a law degree to do this. You can just pretend that, well, I get into the mindset of what I think is a lawyer. The Information Commissioner's Office has got lots of information about exemptions. You can go, I'll talk about decision notices in a minute, but you can look at how the ICO has ruled on other cases, and this could help you with your appeal. But the best book I've come across in terms of appealing rejected freedom of information requests is this book by Matt Burgess. Okay, it's slightly out of date now because it was written about 5 years ago, but for each exemption, he's listed some bullet points as to what arguments you could use to fight against that exemption. I believe that I want to say it's about £10 on Amazon, possibly. If you know, working for a university, just try and get that into your library. I sometimes get questions as to, you know, when do you think it's good to appeal an FOI request? For me, there's a few flags. One thing that I when I see that I get a response and it reads in a very generic way, as if someone's literally sort of cut and copied and pasted something from another document and have applied it to my case. That's a red flag to me. I feel that perhaps the public authority hasn't really read my request properly, really conducted a good search for the information that I'm after. Or I really don't like it when a public authority has refused my request with no real proper explanation as to why. That has happened to me before. One time I got a response from the Independent Parliamentary Standards Authority, which is a small public authority that was set up in the wake of the expenses scandal. I was sent a FOI refusal and it was literally 4 lines long. That's not a good refusal. Or when a public interest test is engaged, the public authority hasn't really taken into proper consideration all the public interest factors in favour of disclosure. I feel like I want to challenge an FOI refusal when I'm hit with lots of exemptions. It kind of sort of raises a red flag to me to say that, they don't really want me to get this information. Okay, I'm up for a bit of a fight here. Or, if you feel really passionate about your FOI request, I would encourage you to appeal. I do think by appealing, you are doing a favour for everyone else. You are literally fighting, if I'm putting my campaigner hat on, you are defending that right to information in a way. We do have a right to information, and what you're doing is putting up a good fight to get hold of the information that you think is valuable. What I might do, Ian, is that I might create a resources folder where I can put in a template or an example of an internal review request, and so I can do that. But with when I write out an internal review request, I tend to have an introduction, a summary of the original request, summary of its outcome, as well as all my arguments as to why the information should be released. I sometimes put in a little bit of extra research in it. I sometimes refer to past articles or past statistics or past research and include some footnotes in there. But again, I think I should share with you a resources folder.
Great.
So with possible outcomes, the authority might be so convinced by your arguments that they might admit that actually they're wrong. They should have given you the information in the first place. I really like that when it happens. Or the authority sticks to their original decision and they don't give you the information that you want. And this has happened to me a couple of times before, is that they've changed their original position and they're now relying on a completely new exemption they're allowed to do that. At this point in time, if you get to this stage, you need to think, okay, should I complain to the Information Commissioner's Office? And you would have to take that a little bit more seriously. If you are ever finding yourself in that position of complaining to the ICO, you sort of create like a mini file a mini sort of case as to why you think the authority has got it wrong, and you will definitely need to get your arguments sorted. I just have to think about deadlines for the minute. You've got 3 months to complain to the ICO when you receive the outcome of that internal review. So, but I would really strongly encourage you to mark those deadlines in your diary. There have been numerous times where I've sometimes forgotten about deadlines for making an ICO complaint or putting in an internal review request. Again, I think I will include an example of an ICO complaint in the resources folder. I will write a note to myself about doing that. If you're ever complaining to the ICO, you will definitely need to attach sort of supporting documentation, the correspondence you've had with the public authority. So I really emphasize, don't delete your emails. And you will also need to fill out a complaint form that's on the ICO website. So at this point in time, you're about 6 months into the process, maybe even more. It takes the ICO a long time to make a decision as to whether the public authority has made the right decision in the first place. That's a long time. Now, unfortunately, the FOI process, if you're ever getting to this stage, it can take up a long time. Now, there's two things. The ICO might be so convinced by your arguments that they might order the public authority to release the information that you was after. They might issue what's called a decision notice, make a ruling, and they ask for the information to be disclosed to you, or they might agree with the public authority and say that you can't have the information that you're after. Now, I know this is a long appeals process, but if you feel really passionate about your request, you really feel that the information that you're after is very vital for the public you've got to think about whether you want to go to the tribunal to argue your case in front of a judge to get the information that you want disclosed to you. I got to say, out of the hundreds, if not thousands of requests I've sent in, there's only been 3 times where I felt it was necessary for me to go to the tribunal and fight my case. I've done it on my own, and I would recommend you trying to get help from lawyers if you can, if they can represent you pro bono, because at this point in time, the language suddenly gets very legalistic and it's all very formal. It's a very formal process, and believe me, one can get lost in that process. It's free to make it, go to the tribunal and argue your case, but it does take a lot of time and energy and headspace. And you've got a very short window to appeal against the ICO's decision notice. But again, if you lose at tribunal, you don't have to pay the other side's costs. So that's good. I'm going to skip that, but if you ever find yourself having to go to the tribunal, do make a big thing of it if you can. So this, a couple of slides back, remember how David Cameron authorised a drone strike that killed 2 UK nationals who had become fighters of the so-called Islamic State. I appealed that. I went all the way to the tribunal, as well as a human rights organisation that did so. At that point in time, I wasn't with a publication, and it was my first time, to be honest. But what was amazing about the human rights organisation was at every stage of the appeal, they were constantly creating noise around this tribunal case. They were issuing press releases about and getting it into places like The Guardian, making a big noise of this, quite a significant case. Unfortunately, we didn't get hold of the legal advice David Cameron relied upon, but we did have some impact on the way national security exemption was being applied to. And what was also nice about this is that the case is named after you. So this is the Calderoy case, and that gives me a nice ego boost now and again. And it's really nice to see other publications, writing about it. It was very exciting, although very nerve-wracking at the time. So I'm just going to pause there before we go on to something completely different, which is the environmental information regulations, but I'm just going to pause there just for now. Any questions?
Yeah, thank you, Jenna. We'll maybe tackle John's in a moment. Mary's asking, how do you get around the safe space argument? Is there a get around?
Not so much a get around, but there's definitely arguments you can, write to undermine that argument. So I tend to go for but we need to scrutinize those decisions that are being made behind closed doors. I really don't buy the safe space argument at all. So I hit back harder with those types of public interest arguments, and sort of say that, if you did disclose the information, how it wouldn't be disruptive, it wouldn't undermine decision making, it probably improve decision making, because the public can feed into how those decisions are informed. Yeah, it is difficult. But I think you can fight against that type of argument for sure.
Okay, thank you. So do you want to come back to John's question, really, about, because reading what John's been posting into the chat, really, there's I think the essence of what you're saying, John, is that there is, I don't want to say collusion, because that suggests something untoward is going, but there is communication between government and public bodies about what information is being, I guess, communicated, shared through FOI requests. Is that something that happens to your knowledge, or have you come across that, Jenna, where one public body maybe is alerting another to what it's about to share or not going to share, and so everyone's on the same page?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is some kind of communication between one or several departments. So, for instance, I was interested in what would it have been? Death penalty assurances. I know that's not a very nice sort of subject, but that request was sent to the Foreign and Commonwealth Office and the Ministry of Defence and another public body, and the responses that came back were almost like for like, the same. And yes, I imagine that there were probably some talk between those departments to, like you say, be on the same page, that they're relying on probably the same exemptions as well. So yes, yeah, I'm going to say, depending on the request, perhaps it might appear sort of round robin in nature. There might be some communications between the departments into how to respond to that particular request. Yes, I believe the FOI directory has previously written about that phenomenon.
Okay. And then John also asks, just to clarify, does the MOD have the same blanket exemptions as the SIS and GCHQ?
Oh, you can send FOI requests into the Ministry of Defence, and I have got information out of them. I've got sort of statistics out of them. They're not, you can send requests into the MOD. Just don't be surprised that they might rely on national security exemption. I have been successful with them, and I do find that the Ministry of Defence is very good at publishing FOI requests that they have previously answered. They do it, I think, weekly last time I checked, which is very good, I think. Yeah.
Okay, great. Mavonwe just says it's worth mentioning that My Society is working on additional functionality for What Do They Know that will guide people through a set of questions that will then filter down the possible challenges to each exemption. So that helps just with what we've been discussing over the last that will help with regard to the challenges that we've been talking about just over the last 15-20 minutes. I think that's it on the questions for now. Jenna, unless you want to go to the environmental stuff.
Brilliant.
You're going to cover that off now, are you?
Yes. How am I doing for time?
We got 20 minutes, so we're
okay. Good. Sorry, I was almost spoiled there. Yep. Okay. All right. Don't worry. We'll hit 6 o'clock. Yeah, for sure. Okay. I just have to might go a little bit fast. Okay. So environmental information regulations. A lot of people tend to oversee them, but these regulations allow us to access information held by public authorities, and writing an environmental information request is very much like writing an FOI request. Apart from at the beginning, I would really emphasize that you say that this is an environmental information regulations request for information right at the beginning, because what is really nice about these regulations is that there's a specific regulation that says a public authority shall apply a presumption in favor of disclosure. We don't have that equivalent in the FOI Act. What's already happening is that the scales already tipped in your favor with the environmental information regulations. So I really would encourage you, if you're asking for something about the environment, like fracking, pollution, radiation, you make sure you put in an environmental information regulations request as opposed to an FOI Act. To me, the regulations are a little bit stronger compared to the FOI Act, but still got 20 working days to expect a response. Interestingly, although I do believe this is probably going to be appealed, and I haven't looked this up to see where it is at the minute, but recently the ICO ruled that Heathrow Airport Limited and the energy company E.ON are public authorities under the environmental information regulations, despite being private companies. Quite an interesting decision, and I would encourage you to read up on that. I did go a little bit too fast previously, but for the purposes of the environmental information regulations, water and sewage utility companies are considered public authorities, not under the FOI Act, but under the EIR. Yes, I looked up on Thames Water website the other day, and you can make an environmental information regulations request to them. You can't under the FOI Act, but under the EIRs, yes. What is nice about the environmental information regulations is that environmental information, the term, is really, really broad, which is good. The environmental information can cover things like the state of the elements of the environment, like air, water, soil, but also things that affect the environment, like radiation, emissions, and measures like policies that has an impact or will have an impact on the environment. So it's good that that term is very, very broad. We can use that to our advantage. Now, the ICO has got lots of information about the environmental information regulations, and I would really recommend that. There's a little small green book from the Centre for Investigative Journalism, only costs about £2–3, that has lots of information about EIRs. It is out of date now, but it's still it's a variable resource. So just very quickly before I move on to the last part, that's all you probably need to know about the environmental information regulations, is that they exist, and that they're probably a little bit stronger than the FOI Act. Have we got any questions about the environmental information regulations before I move on to the last part of today's session?
Well, we just had Archie's question at the beginning, which was, can you send the same FOI request to the EIR authorities?
All right. So with that, I would tend, if I think my request has anything to do with the environment, no matter how I forget the word, but how relevant it is, maybe not incredibly relevant to the environment, I would still make it under the environmental information regulations. The worst thing they can do is turn around and say, it's not about, we're not going to deal with this under the environmental information regulations, we're going to deal with this under the FOI Act. That's the worst thing that can happen. It will still be dealt with as an information request. It's just that the authority has decided that it doesn't, it wants to treat it as an FOI request instead. That doesn't usually happen to me, maybe once or twice. But I would, that's how I would approach that, if that makes sense.
Thank you, Jenna. And actually, my colleague David Baines is he's lobbed a grenade in here. I mean, are the EIR regulations in jeopardy when we leave the EU, given that they were introduced under EU law? Have you heard anything about whether that they're at risk?
I need to look this up. I got a feeling that the campaign for freedom of information has been on this subject. Admittedly, I need to look this up. I would hate for them to be watered down because, climate change, climate disaster, and the environment, these are really, really, really important topics, and I would hate to see any dilution of regulations that are there to help the public to get information about the environment. I would dread that. I don't know is the answer. Apologies.
Yeah. No. We can do a little bit of searching on that maybe.
I'd be interested. Yeah.
And I just remembered when you mentioned the Lugan, the CIJ series of books. I've got this one. I don't know. This may be out of date as well, Jen. I don't know if you recommend it, which is FOIA without the lawyer. It's in that same series. I suspect it is quite old now, but anyway, that's another one in that series.
I got a feeling it's slightly out of date now, but still, the principles, probably still the same. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Jenna.
Cool. And last part, we'll get through this. We'll definitely hit the 6 p.m. deadline. Subject access requests. Now, so under the Data Protection Act, you have a right to access your personal information from public authorities and private companies. So what you do is you put in what's called a subject access request, where the organizations provide you a copy of your personal information or some kind of digest of your personal information. And upon that, they conduct a search. The term personal data is quite broad. It can cover things like your name, address, your medical history, and even handwritten notes taken during interviews. Now, I was a little bit cheeky one time. I put in a subject access request to try and get hold of my personal data held by my old university. I managed to get hold of my original university application, as well as the notes that they took when they interviewed me, which was really enlightening, because I want to say that one supervisor had it in for me on day one. So that kind of confirmed my suspicions. So you can send subject access requests into public authorities, send one into your old university. You can send subject access requests into private companies, banks, utility companies, mobile phone providers, to see what kind of personal data that they have on you. Journalists have certainly encouraged their sources to put in subject access requests to see what kind of personal data is held by authorities. The Guardian, protesters put in subject access requests to the Metropolitan Police to get hold of their personal data, and through that process that they discovered that they were on a domestic extremist database. There was one guy who was in his 80s. He would turn up to protest and just sketch fellow protesters, and those activities were enough to get him on a domestic extremist database. Mark Thomas, journalist, comedian, has also put in a subject access request to the Metropolitan Police to see what kind of personal data they held on him, and it was quite frightening because they held information about his journalistic activities, which I think is really wrong. Very, very recently, Ian Cobain put in a subject access request. So Ian Cobain, he for years he's covered UK arms fairs, but last year for once he was not allowed to attend, and I think he was fobbed off. The organisers said that can't let you in because we're at full capacity, etc. But then he put in a subject access request in to try to find out the real reasons why he was excluded, and it turned out that they didn't want him in because they feared negative coverage media coverage. I thought that's very good use of a subject access request there. I would encourage you to read those stories. I have no idea what this person was doing on Tinder to get 800 pages worth of personal data, but they put in a subject access request in and managed to get hold of what they had. Years ago, a FT journalist put in a subject access request into their mobile phone provider and got hold of their geolocation data and then mapped that geolocation data across London. Like I say, journalists have definitely encouraged sources to put in subject access requests, you know, but I sometimes would, you know, add a little bit of caution to that. If a source came to me and said X, Y, and Z, and they're working for a company and this happened, that happened, I probably wouldn't encourage them to submit a subject access request into their current workplace, because I think it does raise a lot of red flags. You know, I don't want the company, you know, having lots of suspicions about this particular person. Why are they putting in subject access requests in, etc. I would, if a source came to me and said this happened at their old workplace, maybe I would feel a little bit more comfortable in encouraging them to submit a subject access request in. So you see the difference there. I just, you know, it's all about protecting your sources at the end of the day. I just don't want any suspicion being cast upon them by their, let's say, their current employers.
Because just sorry, Jenna, just on that, Chris is asking, will people know that you have asked for a subject access request? Will they
I think it can be obvious. I am quite comfortable with, I mean, it depends. So you've got to think about the context in it. I mean, can you imagine if there's a source that works in a very, very small company and then puts in subject access requests? I just wouldn't. Whereas, you know, if I was encouraging, say a source had a particular bad, an operation that went wrong at a hospital, I would actually encourage them to put in a subject access request in. They would probably know who, you know, I think there's little repercussions. That's what I'm trying to get at, actually, is the potential repercussions towards that person. If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, absolutely,
yeah,
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for keeping the back of your head. There is a template, a good template. If you're ever interested in trying to get hold of your personal data, there is a template on the ICO website. I would say definitely craft it well. You would probably most likely have to provide a photocopy of a passport or utilities bill to prove that it's you that's asking for your personal data, and you've got, you know, 30 calendar days, you know, for them to get back to you. Now, you know, sometimes your subject access requests can be refused, you know, partially, and one of the most common reasons why is that the reductions are, it's a concern, it's to do with other people's personal information. So you might get an email disclosed as part of a subject access request, and you might see the email addresses in the email completely redacted. That's because it identifies someone else, and for them to release that information could breach their data protection rights too. Time and time again, I've heard people put in subject access requests into sort of national security bodies. You won't get anything back. They will apply the national security exemption. But if you're not happy with the way that your subject access request was dealt with, I would definitely make a complaint to the ICO, and they will conduct an assessment into the handling of your request. I have put in subject access requests in to government departments because I haven't been very happy with, you know, how they've responded to my FOI requests or to my you know, requests for comment. There was one particular journalist at BuzzFeed. She put in a subject access request into the Ministry of Justice. She'd been doing lots of articles on legal aid, and she put in a subject access request to the Ministry of Justice, and they disclosed to her internal communications from their press team, and an email was released to her which called her a bitch, So naturally, she wrote a story about that. But you know, I think subject access requests can be incredibly penetrative, incredibly revealing. Now, journalists probably have to be very aware of this, is that, yes, I can send in a subject access request into an organisation, but a person can send in a subject access request to a news outlet, a media outlet, which is a little bit scary because that person is then asking for your journalistic notes. If you ever, if you now there is an exemption that protects journalists for in those certain situations, but if you ever receive a subject access request, don't give over your journalistic notes. Go to a lawyer, get their advice, and or get help before or you know it's a bit scary. I've been on the end. Someone sent in a subject access request, and I've been on the end of it, where you know that person is asking for my journalistic notes. And actually, I did not give over anything to them. I had to, you know, go and consult some lawyers as to what to do in that situation, and that problem was battered away quite quick. But it is quite scary. Got to admit, yeah. But there is an exemption that can help journalists out. But I would say, first of all, get some lawyerly guidance. Now, there's only, out of being in this world, I have only known it to happen to me and another journalist, and that's all. But I think you'll be okay. It's just something to have in the back of your mind as well. Lots of information on the ICO website about subject access requests. And let me take any questions about subject access requests before I wrap up for today.
Yeah, well, just Chris is following up when we were discussing about, you know, would people be notified if we'd put in a subject access request? He's saying, for example, could I ask my employer for information it has about me? If I did that, would old line managers know that I had accessed their interview notes and so on?
I think it'd be pretty obvious. Probably the processes vary from department to department, employer to employer. But yeah, it's I describe a subject access request as putting a bomb on someone's desk. But I think you've got to weigh that up as well. But you know, if you've got nothing to lose. I've certainly come across some very disgruntled people with their workplaces, and you know, have encouraged them to put in subject access requests in to try and get hold of, you know, internal decisions that were made about them. Yeah, if they've got nothing to lose and if they don't fear any, you know, potential repercussions, then why not?
Sure. Mary's asking, how many years can you go back in terms of submitting an SAR, a subject access request?
Yeah, it's so there's not really like a cost exemption. If it's unreasonable, there's some grounds, but there's not really a time frame that one can. I think you can go back as far as possible if you know if they can easily retrieve that information, I suppose. But yeah, not really a time frame. No. I mean, with my example about the handwritten notes and the university application, I'd left that university a good couple of years and then sent one in, and they still managed to find my records. So it can stretch back for a few years, yeah.
And actually, a big shout out to Mary for educating us on EIR. Well, in the sense of, Mary writes, all EU regs had direct effect and had to be introduced into domestic legislation, which also had to be compatible with EU law. So unless repealed, EIR will remain in existence. Yeah, that helps us understand that, and hopefully deflects that risk for a little while anyway. Mafanwe says, I think you're just asking for what information they hold about you, so if they've retained the records they need to provide it. Sorry, I'm a wee bit lost there, Mafanwe, in terms of what that relates to. I think you're just asking for what information they hold about you. So if they've retained the records, they need to provide them.
No,
sorry, that was that was an answer to Mary's question. Yes, regarding how far back you can go. Super. Okay, so I think that's. I mean, John's made a couple of general points, which I'll maybe use at the end. But was there anything else, Jenna, you wanted to add at this point?
No, I don't think so. No.
So John has just said, I think referring back to our discussion about maybe possible collusion between government departments. Lots of organisations obfuscate responses due to historical changes of organisation name or structural administrative changes, and merely reply that the information has been archived or sent to the National Archives, and so therefore the onus is on you to locate it. Frustrating when you're told that information is not held and not provided on request, despite it either already being released into the public domain or is given without problems or compliance to Data Protection Act to other individuals and organisations, or soon issued as a press release. Yeah, no, I think we've seen that happen before. That's incredibly frustrating, isn't it, when that happens?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, there are lots of problems with the FOI Act, and or how it's implemented, I want to say, and I always sort of I really would encourage people to make noises of those types of obstacles and issues. I do, with my campaigning hat on, I do think it's the FOI Act is always, I always feel like it's threatened, and I feel that if we don't defend it, then I do get a sense that maybe it will be watered down, whether authorities can get away with not responding to it on time, which I think we're seeing with big central government departments.